Oh, we got that. Oh, you mean out loud? Yeah. Right on time. Good evening. It's good to see everybody out for another study on our series on the Sermon on the Mount. I forgot to grab the clicker. Okay. Let's summarize the various topics that we've talked about thus far. I think it's good to do that sometimes. And it's not working. Oh, there we go. We began by studying what we call the Beatitudes. Blessed are those, and those are those statements. And again, what did we say about the Beatitudes? Are they individually analyzed to say, okay, there's my ability to punch my ticket to heaven if I'm, to have this characteristic? It's not really presented that way, is it? As a young person, that used to kind of confuse me when I thought about it. Huh? I still couldn't hear you. Yes, it is a compilation of everything that we need, exactly. And the next thing we talked about were being salt and light in the world. Steve referenced this passage in his lesson last Sunday. Then we talked about Christ not being a destroyer of the law of Moses, but a fulfiller of the law of Moses, because the law of Moses pointed to him, did it not? The prophecies and there are statements made with respect to Jesus that are apparent from the Old Testament that he fulfilled, right? Be reconciled to your brother. Don't go to the altar and having something against your brother, leave your gift there. Go be reconciled before you do that. Looking to lust is adultery in the heart. And a lot of these are comparisons to what has been said before from the Old Testament and versus what Christ says concerning his law. And last Sunday we talked about do not divorce except it be for sexual immorality or fornication. We talked about various aspects of that law. And then the second part of our lesson was swear not at all. I noticed Lorenzo did the syllabus, and I noticed I've taught marriage, divorce, and remarriage, and taking oaths, and tonight I have eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If he and I teach again, I'm going to do the syllabus, and he's going to have the hard one. I know that he didn't do that on purpose. So we had an initial syllabus, and I reminded him of some conflicts that I have, and he redid it, and so it's probably my fault. So he knows I'm kidding with him. So let's turn your Bibles now to verse 38 of chapter 5. We're going to read 5 relatively short verses that are going to give us hopefully a full slate of things to talk about tonight. So this thing is not working, or if it is, it's really slow. All right, so I'll rely on y'all to advance the charts. Thank you. So let's read these verses. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. I'm sorry, I had to sneeze. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. Pretty relatively simple statements. Let's talk about this idea of eye for an eye and tooth for the tooth. Okay, you're way ahead of me there. Thank you. As best as I can determine, and according to sources that I read in studying for this, the These phrases, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, are only mentioned 3 times in the Old Testament. And in each case, the context is providing instructions for dealing with matters where a wrongdoer has committed crimes or caused harm to another person, or in the case of a civil matter where they've given, well, all of it's sort of of course they were civil and spiritual, they were interlocked, of course. But in each case, it is in the context of administering punishment to one who has done wrong or caused harm to another person. Let's look at some of these passages and go to the next chart. Leviticus 24, verses 17 through 22. Whoever kills any man shall surely be put to death. Whoever kills an animal shall make it good, animal for animal. If a man causes disfigurement of his neighbor, as he has done, so shall it be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has caused disfigurement of a man, so shall it be done to him. And then it goes on to talk about an animal. Go back to the previous chart. Exodus, the 21st chapter. And we'll go 2 charts forward to the Exodus passage. Thank you. If men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him. And he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Pretty detailed listing there. And the other passage is the passage in Deuteronomy. Well, let me say a little bit about that passage in Exodus. That particular context has to do with a woman with child, a woman who is expecting, and if she's harmed as a result of 2 men fighting, and she has the baby, and if there's harm that is done to that baby or her, the person or the men that caused that will also be punished in a similar way as far as what she experienced. As an aside, it's interesting to see how God views an unborn child in that context. He views it as a person, obviously. So now let's go to the passage on Deuteronomy. This one is also interesting. If a false witness rises against any man to testify against him of wrongdoing, then both men in the controversy shall stand before the Lord, before the priest and the judges who serve in those days. And the judges shall make careful inquiry, and indeed, if the witness is a false witness who has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother, and so you shall put away the evil from among you. And then he goes on to say in the latter part, 25, your eye shall not pity, life shall be for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So this is a situation where an individual is giving testimony in a proceeding, a legal proceeding, in which another person apparently is being under trial, and this person gives false testimony. And if it had been, if the person under trial would have been subject to some punishment such as death or eye for eye, tooth for tooth, then they would have administered this to the person who was giving false testimony, the perjurer, in that case. Those are the 3 that I know of. 3 mentions of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and again, if the sources that I consulted are accurate, then it is only 3 times. There's also the idea of it, though, in Numbers 35 and in other passages, the Avenger of Blood, where if a person causes the death of another person, the Avenger of Blood had the right to take that person's life. Of course, built into that was the ability for a person who had caused another's death to go and visit a city or stay in a city of refuge, seek protection until the matter could be adjudicated properly. So again, there was a provision there. Again, it doesn't say eye for eye, tooth for tooth, but it is that similar concept. So, yeah, but I mean, it might be a situation where it was questioned, And I might need to stand corrected on that. I need to probably look at that a little more closely. But yeah, it was a matter of manslaughter, or until a person could be judged properly, as I understand it. Okay, let's go to the chart that begins with, there we go. So it seems that Jesus had those passages in mind when he began speaking here in verse 38. And even though they are paraphrased by what seems to be a civil penal context, Jesus appears to apply these to individual retribution, or the desire of those to seek retribution on individuals. And that seems to be his focus. And his focus is on what is our attitude as Christians. What does he expect our attitude to be when we face evil treatment, or we face unfair treatment or unjust treatment from others? And if you look at this arrangement and notice verse 43, begins to talk about you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. So in that context, I think it's all kind of very closely connected. And in fact, if you check Luke's account, in fact, I've got that, and let's just go ahead and read Luke's account. Should be the next verse, next chart. Notice how he begins by speaking of love your enemies. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. To him who strikes you on the one cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who asks of you. And from him who takes away your goods, do not ask them back. And just as you want men to do to you, you also do to them likewise. So you see, Luke actually connects the idea of loving your enemies with this. Do good to those who hate you. And we can see, I think it's all kind of part of the same story, the same discussion in many ways. So let's talk a little bit about, I think we'll go to the next, let's go to the next chart. It says, do not resist an evil person. So I went and looked up the word resist just to get a sense for what he was talking about. It is from a Greek word that I won't attempt to pronounce, but it is signifying to withstand or oppose or resist. So it's an idea of giving resistance to someone who is mistreating us. So if someone slaps one cheek, are we to resist and fight back and hit them back? According to Jesus, we are not in that sense. If they sue us for our undershirt, which with a tunic was a garment that was, I think, worn close to the body, we're to give them what? Our outer garment, or our cloak. Per the Old Testament, I found this today, and I did not remember this. If a person gave you their outer coat, their cloak, and you have to remember in this society, garments were probably viewed more as capital items than the way we have most of us have a big closet full of clothes, more than we can probably wear. I doubt that was the case in that culture. And a cloak would have been something that was something of value, and someone might leave that as a pledge with someone else. But the Bible tells us that it was not to be kept overnight. God's fairness of understanding that the person needed it for the night dictated that it not be left, that the person had to take it back, right? But if you think about it in that sense, what Jesus is saying is, not only give him your undergarment, give him your cloak, in the context of something that really wasn't supposed to be kept. He's saying going above and beyond what is even allowed by the law, right? Under his reign and rule and his kingdom, we're to even go beyond what the law demanded. Give him your cloak also. Next chart. Oh, you're way ahead of me. With y'all doing the charts like this, we're going to get done in about 20 minutes. But, I'm just kidding. I'm glad you're doing. That's Jeremy paying me back, or maybe it's Greg, for that night I set the book down on the clicker and it advanced about 50 slides. And I'm looking back there, I'm like, what are y'all doing? And then I realized everybody was looking at Jeremy, right? And what's Jeremy doing? And it was me up here. I don't know if you remember that. It's been probably 5 or 6 years ago. Anyway, enough of that. If they ask you to go a mile, what are you supposed to do? Go 2 miles. And I got interested about that, and I thought, they used miles like we do. And their mile was not technically quite as long as ours, although it was still a considerable distance. 4860 feet was a Roman mile. 5280 feet is a mile according to our standards. So it's about 9/10, a little over 9/10 of a modern mile. So pretty considerable distance. Ultimately, you're going to walk about 1.8 miles with them. And I've got a note here. History tells us that Roman soldiers, as they were marching through, had the right to compel people who were standing watching to take their what do they call it? Their pack. You know, soldiers take packs when they're on marches. They even do that today, right? And a soldier could compel a regular citizen to carry that pack for him for a mile. So if you think about that in the context of this verse, this would not be something that would sound too unusual. You know, how many people here is going to ask you to go a mile with them? There might be some who are runners or something like that, but in that society, this would have been something that could have very well have happened. And what he's saying is, don't turn away. Give of him who asks of you. Go that extra mile. If someone asks of you, don't turn away one who wants to borrow from you. And Luke 16 even adds that if someone takes it from you, as we read a minute ago, don't ask for it to be returned. Lorenzo?
I was going to mention, if you think about Simon of Cyrene, there are
Yeah.
ones who have definitely abused that power that they had to have, hey, carry my thing for me. Well, now carry a cross.
Yeah.
At least a post. So, it would have been probably abused even. So it would have hurt a little bit more if somebody said, well, I already have to do what they said.
Yeah.
Knowing that they are going above and beyond what they should tell me to do. And now I have to do it twice as long. So it would have been a little bit more painful for them to hear that.
I think as I studied one of the sources, they mentioned Simon of Cyrene being compelled to carry the cross. And they're going to be asked to carry, even do more. So good thought there. All right, let's go to the next chart. It is all the charts, right? So, on the surface, I think this is relatively simple. I think we have a lot of questions about it. And there are questions as to how much it applies. I think a very conservative view of it is that if we are compelled to treat someone who is committing evil against us, that we are not to resist, right? I'm going to stop here and pause and ask, what are your comments or questions?
To me, the whole Sermon on the Mount, the way Jesus starts it, is for centuries this culture has had everything written, and all these I's dotted and T's crossed, and everything was very documented and very legislated. And Jesus is trying to get them to get off the documents and get back to the heart. And they took, you heard, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and Jesus is saying, you've heard all this, but you turned my Father's law that was a law of justice into a law of revenge. You did this to me, now I've got the right to do this back to you. Don't get excited about being able to do that back to him because you did this to me. And it turned into a law of revenge. And he's trying to get them to understand that's not what it was. It was meant to be justice from the beginning. It had nothing to do with revenge. And so as he goes through and he progresses going from eye to eye, then the next thing he goes, he's doubling. You know, you can't give 2 eyes. I guess you could give 2 eyes. But after that, you kind of have a look. And then, you know, if somebody asks for to go 1 mile, you go with them 2. If they ask for your cloak, you know, give them everything. They doubled it. And so if you're trying to get them to understand, it's not this legislated, regulated thing. It goes back to your heart.
So I understand what you're saying. There is a sense in which they were strictly a rule following, and they were not, even though they were supposed to, even under the old law, to be convicted in their hearts. There is an emphasis on for us today to follow Jesus from the heart. You know, I think is your point. I would say this: I do think there is an aspect, a considerable aspect today, to the, I don't know if legislated is the right word, but the written word and the fact that we're to live by the written word. I do think there is a responsibility that we have in following the written word, but again, we can do that today, even now. We can be very strict about rule keeping and law keeping and doing all the things that we're expected to do, be here 3 times a week and be at all the gospel meetings and have all the right positions on everything according to whoever decides that. And yet we might not be right in our hearts. So, good points. Rob?
I think one thing that you have to think about is a lot of the Old Testament laws like this were instituted in order to as a deterrent to make people be careful about what they did towards other people, because the same thing was going to be metered out to them. And a lot of our laws today are deterrents. It really doesn't help the victim that much, other than gives maybe some peace of mind to see someone punished for something that they did that wronged us. But Jesus He's given us a mandate to reach out to others. And one of the ways that we can do that is, even though the law says you can do this, we are to have a spirit of forgiveness, the kind of spirit that will make an impression on that person for good, in hopes that they might obey the gospel and be saved eternally. And so I think there's 2 different aspects there. One, a written law for the purpose of deterring criminal activity and activity that might cause negligent damage to someone, versus a spirit of forgiveness. And I kind of think that that's what he's getting at here, and I think that continues in the next section. So
I appreciate those comments, and I don't have to summarize because you've got that on the microphone, so I appreciate that, Jeremy. In terms of the things that Jesus was teaching compared to what they knew about being children of God, how do you think all of, not just tonight's passages, but all of what we studied, this would have been pretty radically different than what they were accustomed to, right? Even tonight, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And it has been suggested that that even though those were in the context of the not just recommended, but the required penalty for when a person committed a crime and caused a certain thing to happen to another individual, that some people were taking that and probably taking what was, again, to be administered by in a civil matter by a group of people. It was being done on, it had been maybe corrupted to claim that an individual could exact revenge when someone did something to them. And I think there might be some merit to that. Again, we want to be careful with the word and not draw too many conclusions, but Jesus obviously had a reason for addressing this subject. And it seems to me as though some were probably using these passages to go out and say, okay, he did something to me, then I've got a right to go get them. And let me ask you this, how many people today live by that? Right? Somebody comes into their property and to steal something, what are they going to do to them? They're going to be ready to shoot them. Can a Christian operate by that principle according to what we're reading tonight? I do not think that we can. Even though there's the part of us that says we're going to defend our property. We're going to defend. And I know there are questions about when to apply certain parts of this. For instance, when a person who, if we take it in a very literal sense, and maybe we should do that, a person who asks of you, are we obligated under every circumstance to give them what they are asking for? Like a person comes up to you and says, hey, can you give me some money? My car's broken down, or I'm hungry. And are we on every circumstance obligated to give them money? Because I think a lot of times the best thing to do is say, hey, I'll go buy you some food, or I'll help fix your car. And you find out pretty quick a lot of times that that's not really what they're after. They're after your money. But are we obligated in those circumstances when we know that, again, in light of passages such as, if a person will not work, neither let him eat, are we obligated to make that evaluation even though the passage, taking in a very literal, exact sense, would not allow for that exception? Are we in a position, do we look at other passages that also might have merit or might have relevance? And the more I've thought about this, the more we decide about how we apply these passages, what do they have to be built up? What does it have to be built? Our view, our decision, our position, what does it have to be supported by? The Word. It cannot be supported by an emotional appeal. As much as we might want to do it and as much as we might feel that, we have to have it, it says. Comments. We only had 5 verses. And I'm not blaming Lorenzo either. It was a good syllabus.
Scott, under the law, when they were found guilty, were they turned over to the family for punishment?
So I looked at some of those passages that we looked at earlier, and I want to say I know 1, maybe 2, maybe all of them to some degree were in the context of the congregation carrying out the punishment. I know in one case it absolutely said that, because I had that same question: who's actually doing this? And it seemed to me that it was being done again by the people as a group. They were, in some cases, they were to be stoned. So, but that's a good question, and I think it's a relevant question. Yes.
I think this goes along with a couple of the comments.
Tell you what, let's get your microphone. Thank you.
Kind of going along with a couple of the comments already said, the 2 topics in our class tonight, it seems like Jesus is saying to them, you have heard that it is said. That doesn't necessarily mean that's how it was applied back there in the Word. And in all of this, Jesus, just like those disciples he sent out and told them to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, and then we could also say backed up by what the Word actually says, and they saw the words eye for an eye, but you're right, every time it is about a judicial inquiry sentence passed. Careful inquiry was to be made. Back in Deuteronomy 17, it says that they were not to act presumptuously. So vigilante justice was actually condemned under the law as well. And then the second one, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. The law doesn't say that. The law never said, and hate your enemy. In fact, it's the opposite. It is being compassionate of those that dwell among you and such. But how they were hearing it was they were treated prejudiciously, but they were also extremely prejudiced against those who were not of their own, and seemed to have found a way to almost justify it and be mean to those folks. And he says that's just not what it says.
Yeah, good comments, and I appreciate you particularly bringing out what we'll study on Sunday. I think there is a lot of merit to the idea that they were taking biblical principles from the Old Testament that should have been applied in a certain way, and they were corrupting it in a sense and applying it in a way that was not intended. And I think it strongly implied that individuals were, well, there was justification being made for individual revenge based on those principles, those passages. So I think that's a good point. Nathan?
I just wanted to say, I think it's worth mentioning when the apostles were on the Sabbath picking grain and eating it, they were accused of breaking the Sabbath law. And Jesus doesn't say that they aren't breaking the Sabbath law later. And I know that that's not what we're talking about, but I think it applies. And his example is how David took of the showbread even though it's not lawful. And he doesn't try to make the argument that it was lawful for David to take that showbread. He just says that it was justified. And I think that the point is, in certain circumstances, you need to look at what the spirit of what the law was, rather than holding it to this, I'm trying to think of my words here, but like this standard where that there's no exception, I suppose. And here with an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, maybe he's kind of trying to say that it doesn't always need to be like that. You can show mercy. I don't know. I just thought it was worth mentioning.
All right, I appreciate you raised some interesting points. I had some other charts that I was going to show, and I worried that it might spur a debate that might not necessarily be good. When I read some of these passages, there are some things that come to my mind that I wonder about, and how we apply these passages and the extent to which we apply them. And are there other passages that come into play? And I'll read some of the questions that I had. When he says, if someone slaps you on the cheek, turn to him the other cheek, does that imply that we're to sit there and let them beat us unmercifully? I don't think it really means that. And offer no resistance. Does it imply that, do we have the right to call law enforcement, who the Bible says bears not the sword in vain? There were times where Paul was under duress from other people, being mistreated, and he escaped. He did not sit there and endure all that. He used reasonable means to evade it. He did. That's the next passage I have here. I was going to kind of just skip it, but you're right. He appealed to Caesar. Again, and there's no indication that he did anything wrong in doing that. Now, did he use that as a means to avoid mistreatment? I think there's argument to be made there. Does the command to love your neighbor as yourself authorize resisting to protect someone? I don't have all the answers figured out. I'll be honest with you. I struggle with them. But I'll go back again and say this. Any position that we take on the application of these verses has to be supported by Scripture. We have to have a sound, fundamental foundation for whatever view we take. And I think probably in this room there are different views on how we do that. Can we still all be a cohesive unit and still continue to study it and try to be unified? I think we can. But I think we have to be sensitive to other people's views on it and keep studying it. But those are some questions that come to my mind that, again, I've not totally figured out. Are we to allow all of our possessions and wealth to be taken by some evil person? It does say, don't resist the one, don't deny a person who asks of you. So is there a context there, or is there a limitation, a reasonable understanding of what's really intended? Do we do that to the point where we no longer have the means to provide for our families, which the Bible says if a person doesn't provide for their own, they're worse than an infidel? Do we have a responsibility to protect some of those things?
There may be a little difference in the wording there. Taking, if he comes and takes it, that's different from you giving it to him, if he asks for it.
Yeah, true. But it also says, I believe in Luke's account, we're not to ask for it back. And that might be hard to follow. But I really think generally that's what God expects of us. Okay, if someone asks something from us, are we supposed to go back and hound them and say, hey, that fancy dish that you borrowed from me, I want it back. That was my grandmother's and it's been in my family for X number of years and I want it back. Any other comments, questions? Brent?
Just had some thoughts. In each of these,
So kind of a long walk, but
in each of these cases, you might say, Jesus is describing some things that are, as he called it, kingdom citizens. His heart, his speech, his actions, and how we're to act. I do believe that he is contrasting, giving an example of old covenant law. I do believe he's given an example of old covenant law and just using that as a springboard to point out to Christians, kingdom citizens, how they are to act, how they are to feel, speak, and act. Just one comment for thought. Like in Psalm 139, David would describe how that he hated his enemies with perfect hatred. God would command, like in 1 Samuel 15, Israel to destroy Amalek. So there was, you might say, hatred in action. We look at examples of like love in action. Your enemy's ox is in the ditch. Here's a fellow Israelite. You help him. So there's love in action. He didn't actually say in that passage, you're loving your enemy or you're loving your neighbor, but you're doing love in action. 1 Samuel 15, destroying Amalek was hatred in action. Again, like David would say in 1 Samuel 1, or Psalm 139, he hated his enemies with perfect hatred. When God told them to destroy that enemy, they were to do it, and that was hatred in action.
Yeah.
And so we see, and I know this is Sunday's lesson, but Christians are to love the enemy. Actually, the very enemy that they could hate under the old covenant, a national enemy. Christians, Jesus is regulating how we think and feel and speak and act. These are kingdom principles. Basically don't retaliate in the section you're covering.
appreciate those comments. They're very good. I will say this, when we study this and seek to apply it, I would not approach it with an attitude of, how can I figure out ways to get around it? Does that make sense? I would approach it from the attitude of understanding it completely, making sure that whatever I say about it is backed up by Scripture, and that I'm applying it correctly. And I know that's not easy. It's easier said than done, maybe. But I'm afraid sometimes we can almost approach it and we lose sight of what Jesus is really telling us to do. And when someone asks of us, we are commanded to give. And again, that doesn't mean we can't make a reasonable judgment as to whether or not they should be getting something. But we do have that responsibility. And we are to turn the other cheek. And that sometimes we have mistreatment. And someone might strike us on the face or mistreat us in some other way. We do have a responsibility to carry that out as He is instructing us to do. So, thank you for your comments.